At my father's funeral, my brothers mocked me for being poor, then went inside to celebrate their inheritance. That was the moment family betrayal crossed into something unforgivable. They thought I was weak. They didn't know I was the one controlling the trust, the money, and their future. This isn't just family drama. This is a revenge and justice story where greed finally meets consequences. My brothers raised their champagne glasses, toasting to a fortune they hadn't earned. They looked at my worn-out shoes and laughed, calling me the spare heir who deserved nothing. They thought the $50 million was already theirs. They didn't know I wasn't just the quiet sister in the corner. I was the one holding the remote detonator to their financial lives, and I was about to push the button. My name is Elara Vance, and to understand why I posed such a threat to my brother's inheritance, you had to understand exactly what kind of people my brothers were. The rain at the cemetery felt like a cliché, but my brother's behavior was an even bigger one. Julian and Marcus stood under a massive logo-emblazoned umbrella held by an assistant, checking their watches every 30 seconds. They looked like vultures in Italian silk suits, hovering over the grave of the man they had ignored for the last decade of his life, our father. I stood 10 feet away, soaked to the bone in a black dress I'd bought at a thrift store 3 years ago. I didn't care about the rain. I cared that the only person who had ever truly understood me was being lowered into the ground. To Julian and Marcus, Dad was an ATM that had finally dispensed its last withdrawal. To me, he was just Dad. "Look at her," Julian whispered, though his stage whisper was loud enough for half the mourners to hear. "Drowned rat look is in this season, I guess." Marcus snorted, adjusting his diamond cufflinks. "She's probably hoping there's a sandwich buffet at the wake. Heard she's behind on rent again." They weren't wrong about the rent. I lived in a studio apartment the size of their walk-in closets. I drove a car that rattled when it idled. I worked as a freelance archivist, a job they considered synonymous with unemployed. They thought I was pathetic. They thought I was weak. But what they didn't know was that my poverty was a choice, a test I had set for myself, and a lifestyle Dad had respected. More importantly, they didn't know what Dad and I had been doing every Sunday night for the last 5 years, while they were partying in Ibiza or gambling in Vegas. After the service, the lawyer, Mr. Sterling, approached us. He was a stoic man with eyes like flint. "The reading of the will is scheduled for 4 p.m. at my offices. Attendance is mandatory." "Can't we just do a wire transfer?" Julian scoffed, opening his car door. "I have a flight to catch tonight." "Mandatory," Sterling repeated, his gaze sliding over to me with a subtle nod that my brothers missed entirely. "Fine," Marcus grumbled. He looked at me. "Need a ride, Elara, or are you taking the bus?" "Actually, take the bus. I don't want wet upholstery." They sped off in matching luxury sedans. I took the bus. When I arrived at the law firm, my brothers were already seated in the plush leather chairs, drinking the firm's scotch. They had their feet up on the mahogany table. They looked like kings of a kingdom they hadn't conquered. "Sit down, Cinderella," Julian said, gesturing to a small wooden chair in the corner. "Don't worry, we've already discussed it. We're going to be generous. We'll set up a small allowance for you, maybe $2,000 a month, enough to keep you off the streets, provided you don't annoy us." "That's very kind of you," I said softly, taking my seat. "It is," Marcus agreed, scrolling through his phone. "Dad's assets are complicated. Real estate, stocks, the offshore holdings. You wouldn't understand the liquidity ratios. It's best if the men handle the heavy lifting. You just sign where we tell you to sign." Mr. Sterling entered the room. He placed a single thick file on the table. The room went silent. "Gentlemen, Elara," Sterling began, "I will skip the preamble. Your father, Arthur Vance, died with an estate valued at approximately $52 million. Julian high-fived Marcus. "Boom, told you." "However," Sterling continued, his voice raising a decibel, "the structure of the inheritance is specific. Specific how? Marcus asked, narrowing his eyes. The entirety of the estate, the liquid cash, the portfolio, the properties in the Hamptons and Aspen, has been placed into the Vance Family Trust. Standard procedure to avoid taxes. Julian waved his hand dismissively. Who were the trustees? Me and Marcus, obviously. Sterling adjusted his glasses. Actually, neither of you are trustees. You are beneficiaries. But there is a clause, the competence and character clause. Access to the funds is contingent upon the approval of the sole executor and trustee. Okay, so who is it? Uncle Jerry? Just give us the contact info. We'll smooth it over, Marcus demanded. Sterling looked at me. The sole executor and trustee, with absolute power over the disbursement or freezing of all assets, is Elara Vance. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a tank. Julian's glass stopped halfway to his mouth. Marcus slowly turned his head toward me, his neck creaking. Her? Julian laughed, a nervous hacking sound. That's a typo. She can't even balance a checkbook. She's a librarian or whatever. Archivist, I corrected calmly, and I have a master's in forensic accounting, Julian. You'd know that if you ever asked me a single question about my life. Forensic what? Marcus stood up, his face turning red. This is a joke. Dad was senile. We'll contest this. She's incompetent. The clause is ironclad, Sterling said. Your father spent 5 years setting this up. Elara has managed his private accounts for the last 3 years. In fact, she is the one who grew the portfolio from 30 million to 50. My brothers looked at me with new eyes, not with respect, but with fear. And then the greed took over again. Okay, Julian said, his voice dropping to a smooth, manipulative purr. Elara, look, we're family. You're in charge, that's great. Go ahead and authorize the transfer. We have investments pending. We need 5 million each by tomorrow. I opened the folder in front of me. I pulled out a stack of papers. They weren't legal documents, they were bank statements. Specifically, Julian and Marcus's bank statements. Investments? I asked, looking at the papers. Is that what we're calling the $2 million you embezzled from Dad's company operating account while he was in chemo, Julian? Julian's face went pale. That was a loan. And Marcus, I continued, picking up another sheet. The shell company in the Caymans where you tried to divert the dividends? Did you think I wouldn't find it? I built the tracking software that monitors those accounts. You little witch, Marcus snarled, lunging forward. Sign the release. That money is ours. You're nothing. You're poor. You're nobody. I am the trustee, I said, my voice icy. And as of this morning, I have invoked the character clause. What does that mean? Julian whispered. It means, I said, standing up for the first time, that I have determined both of you to be financially irresponsible and morally bankrupt. Therefore, under the terms of the trust, you are disinherited. You can't do that, Marcus screamed. I already did, but that's not the worst part. I pulled out my phone and placed it on the table. Because you tried to access the funds this morning using Dad's old passwords I changed yesterday, you triggered a federal fraud alert. And since I submitted the evidence of your embezzlement to the SEC and the district attorney an hour ago, the sound of sirens wailing in the distance grew louder. It wasn't ambient city noise. It was getting closer. You didn't! Julian gasped, backing away toward the door. You stole from a dying man, I said, my voice trembling with the rage I had suppressed for years. You mocked me for being poor while you stole the money he worked for. You laughed at me. Who's laughing now? The heavy oak doors of the conference room burst open. 2 officers and a detective stepped in. Julian Vance? Marcus Vance? The detective asked. "It's a misunderstanding," Marcus yelled, pointing at me. "She's lying. She's trying to steal our inheritance." "We have the wire logs, sir," the detective said, pulling out handcuffs, "and the testimony of the trustee." I watched as my brothers, the men who had terrorized me since childhood, were handcuffed in their bespoke suits. They screamed obscenities at me. They begged. They cried. As they were dragged out, Julian looked back at me, his eyes wide with shock. "Elara, please, we're family!" I looked him dead in the eye. "Family takes care of family, Julian. Dad told me to take care of the money. He knew you'd waste it. He knew you were rotten. He left it to me because he knew I'd use it to fix the damage you caused." The door closed. The room was quiet again. Mr. Sterling poured 2 glasses of scotch. He slid one across the table to me. "Your father would have been proud," Sterling said. I took a sip. It burned, but it felt good. He knew this would happen? He hoped it wouldn't, Sterling admitted, but he prepared for it if it did. "The 50 million is yours, Elara, free and clear. The brothers are out. What will you do?" I walked to the window and looked down at the street. I saw the police cruisers flashing their lights, taking my brothers away. I thought about my studio apartment. I thought about the debts my brothers had racked up in the company name, jeopardizing the pensions of 300 employees. "First," I said, turning back to the lawyer, "we make the employees' pension fund whole. Every cent Julian and Marcus stole comes back. And then, I smiled, I'm going to buy a raincoat. A really expensive one. They wanted me to be the poor sister. I was never poor. I was just waiting for the check to clear."